She was on her knees, scrubbing the floor, when the mother-in-law pointed at her and screamed, "Get this dirty maid out of my son's wedding," not knowing that the woman on that floor owned half the country, and the other half, she was about to own that too. That moment froze every single person in that ballroom. The waitstaff stopped moving, the orchestra went quiet, the flower girls looked at their mothers, and the groom, he just stood there at the altar, watching, his hands trembling, because he knew something his mother did not. He knew exactly who that woman was. He had always known, and now the whole world was about to find out. But to understand why this moment shattered everything, you have to go back. You have to go back 23 years to a red dirt road in Enugu State, Nigeria, where two little girls said goodbye to each other and never expected that goodbye to last a lifetime. If you enjoy thrilling African stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and tell us where you are watching from. Your support means the world to us. Lagos called her the Quiet Billion. That was the nickname the business press had given to Adaeze Okonkwo Briggs, not because she was shy, not because she was timid, but because unlike every other billionaire who ran their empire with noise, press conferences, magazine covers, charity galas plastered across Instagram, Adaeze did it in silence. Her company, Okonkwo Holdings, moved money the way water moves underground. You never saw it, but you felt it everywhere. She had fingers in oil bunkering along the Niger Delta coast, a chain of five-star hotels that stretched from Abuja to Accra, a logistics empire that handled 30% of West Africa's cross-border freight, and a private equity fund that had swallowed 3 mid-sized banks in the last 4 years alone. Forbes had estimated her net worth somewhere between 4 and 7 billion US dollars. Adaeze never confirmed or denied the number. She simply smiled whenever someone brought it up, a small private smile that told you the real number was something she alone would ever know. Her penthouse sat on the 42nd floor of a tower on Banana Island, Ikoyi, Lagos, where the city lights of Lagos spread below her like scattered diamonds every single night. She had a Rolls-Royce Cullinan in matte black that she never drove herself, a Gulfstream G700 on standby at Murtala Mohammed Airport, a personal chef trained at Le Cordon Bleu in Paris, a wardrobe curated by a stylist who flew in from Milan 4 times a year. She had everything the world could offer a human being. And yet, there was one room in that penthouse she never entered. It was the room at the end of the East Corridor, the one with the pale yellow door. She had painted it yellow herself with her own hands 3 years after she moved in. Pale yellow, the color of the dress her sister used to wear every Sunday morning in Enugu, the color of the last memory she had of the little girl who had vanished from her life without a trace. Her sister's name was Enozi, and for 23 years Adaeze had been looking. Private investigators, government contacts, international missing persons databases. She had spent money on the search that would have made grown men weep. She had hired people who found people that governments couldn't find. She had followed leads to Cameroon, to London, to Ghana, to South Africa. Every lead died. Every trail went cold, and every night Adaeze Okonkwo Briggs, the woman Lagos called the Quiet Billion, would sit at the edge of her bed in her silent penthouse and whisper her sister's name into the dark, like a prayer nobody was answering. That was the wound money couldn't touch. That was the one crack in the armor that no deal, no acquisition, no Forbes ranking had ever been able to fill. The wedding was not supposed to be her concern. Adaeze had not even planned to attend. Her godson, Emeka Nwofor, the son of her closest friend from university, was marrying a girl from a family in Anambra State, a family called the Oyelarans, and Adaeze had sent a generous gift 3 weeks in advance and quietly asked her assistant to send her apologies. She was in the middle of a hostile acquisition. She had no time for weddings. But Chisom, Emeka's mother and Adaeze's oldest friend, had called her herself, not through assistants, not through text. She had called and said 3 words, "Please, for me." And Adaeze had sighed, closed her laptop, and told her driver to bring out the Cullinan.
She arrived at the venue, a luxury event hall in Victoria Island called the Crown House, 40 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. She had not come in through the main entrance. She slipped in through the side, the way she always did at events, because she hated the attention her name carried into any room. She was wearing simple clothes, dark trousers, a plain blouse, no jewelry except the thin gold chain around her wrist that she never took off. She looked like staff. That was the first mistake the mother of the groom would make. The second mistake would cost her everything. The mother of the groom was a woman named Mrs. Beatrice Chukwuemeka. Lagos knew her too, but for different reasons. She was known in the social circles of Lekki Phase 1 as a woman of enormous pride and meticulous standards. She had married into money, watched that money grow through her late husband's construction contracts, and had spent the last decade making sure everyone within a 3-kilometer radius knew about it. She wore her titles like armor. She was the kind of woman who introduced herself as Chief Mrs. even in casual conversations. She had organized this wedding the way a general organizes a military campaign. Every detail had been planned, approved, and obsessed over. The flowers alone had cost more than most people's annual salaries. She had personally reviewed the seating chart 6 times. The photographer was flown in from Johannesburg. The reception menu had been taste-tested on 3 separate occasions. And she was walking through the venue that morning with the sharp eyes of someone looking for any imperfection to correct, when she turned a corner and saw a woman she did not recognize bending over near the floral arrangements by the entrance corridor. The woman was adjusting something, a flower that had tilted in its vase, she would explain later. And from where Mrs. Beatrice stood, all she saw was someone in plain clothes touching her carefully arranged decorations. She did not ask. She did not approach calmly. Mrs. Beatrice was not a woman who did things calmly when she felt her territory was being disturbed. She clapped her hands twice, loud and sharp, the way you call a dog to attention, and she pointed at the woman and said, loudly enough for 6 people nearby to hear, "You there, Maid! Who asked you to touch that? You people cannot be trusted with anything. Get away from there and go back to the kitchen where you belong." Adaeze stood up slowly. She turned around. And that is the moment the world would later say was the beginning of the end for Mrs. Beatrice Chukwuemeka. Because Adaeze looked at her, really looked at her, with eyes that held no anger, no shock, no embarrassment. Just a quiet, careful looking, the way you look at something you are still deciding what to make of. She said nothing. She simply stepped back from the flowers, smoothed her blouse, and walked away toward the side of the hall where guests were beginning to gather. Mrs. Beatrice watched her go and felt the brief satisfaction of someone who believes they have just restored order. She turned to the event coordinator beside her and said, "These caterers always bring the wrong people. Someone needs to control the help around here." Nobody corrected her, not yet. The ceremony began at noon. Adaeze took a seat near the back, close to the aisle, as she always did at events, easy to leave, easy to remain invisible. She watched the groom walk in. Emeka looked nervous in the good way, the way men look when they are about to receive something they have been afraid to hope for. She smiled at him from across the room, and he caught her eye and exhaled. Then the doors opened for the bride, and Adaeze's world cracked down the middle. The young woman walking down that aisle, the bride dressed in white with orange blossoms woven into her hair, had a face, a specific face, a face that did not belong to a stranger. It was a face that Adaeze had searched in every crowd for 23 years. It was a face she had drawn from memory for private investigators and had wept over in the dark. It was a face with the same wide-set eyes, the same slight gap between the front teeth when she smiled, the same way of carrying her chin slightly upward when she was nervous, a habit their mother used to tease about. It was Enozi. No, it couldn't be.
Adaeze gripped the edge of the chair in front of her. Her knuckles went pale.
She felt the room tilt slightly, the way rooms tilt when your body knows something your mind is still refusing to accept. She blinked. She looked again. The bride was gliding past her now, close enough to touch, looking straight ahead at the man she loved. And Enozi saw the thin scar, that very specific scar on the left side of her jaw from falling off the guava tree in their grandmother's compound in 1999, and that was when she stopped breathing. The scar was there. This was not a resemblance. This was not wishful thinking playing tricks on a tired woman's eyes. This was her blood. This was her sister. This was Enozi, walking past her in a wedding dress, alive, breathing, smiling, whole. And she did not know that the woman watching her from the back of the room was the sister she had lost before she was old enough to fully remember losing her. Enozi sat perfectly still through the entire ceremony. She did not speak. She did not cry, not because she was cold, but because she was too full. She was so full of feeling that her body had simply chosen stillness as its only available response. She watched her sister take vows. She watched her sister receive a ring. She watched her sister become a wife, and she said nothing, not yet. She needed to know more before she said anything. She needed to be certain. She needed to understand how this had happened, how Enozi had come to be here, how 23 years of a life had been lived without the two of them finding each other. She needed to understand what had separated them in the first place. The year was 2001. Enozi had been 16 years old. Enozi had been 4. Their mother had been sick. A sickness that moved fast and hit hard, the kind that in a city with proper hospitals might have been manageable, but in a small town in Enugu state in 2001 was a death sentence delivered slowly over 6 months. When their mother died, there was nothing. No savings, no land, no insurance. Just a one-room house with a zinc roof and 2 daughters, one old enough to grieve and one young enough not to fully understand what grief was. Relatives came, the way relatives come in these situations, circling, assessing, making quiet decisions about who could be housed and who could not. Enozi had been taken in by their mother's older sister in Lagos, a stern and practical woman who had said clearly, "I can only take one. The older one can help around the house." A neighbor had agreed to take Enozi temporarily, just until arrangements could be made, just until someone in the extended family could take her properly. No one ever did. By the time Enozi had saved enough money, worked enough odd jobs, scratched and clawed her way through secondary school on a borrowed uniform and sheer stubbornness, by the time she had found her footing in Lagos and gone back to Enugu to find her sister, the neighbor had moved. The house was different people. The whole street had changed. And Enozi, little Enozi, 4 years old and already lost, was gone. What Enozi did not know, what she could not have known, was that Enozi had been taken in by a family who had since relocated to Anambra State, changed their surname through marriage, and raised Enozi as their own daughter in a household that had given her love, but had never, in all those years, been fully honest with her about where she had truly come from. Enozi had grown up knowing she was adopted. She had not known her birth name. She had not known she had a sister. She had not known that somewhere in Lagos, in a penthouse on the 42nd floor, a woman smelling of expensive perfume and quiet grief was burning her nights away searching for her. Enozi had grown into a woman named Ada Oyelaran. She was a school teacher. She was 27 years old. She was kind and gentle and laughed easily, and was marrying a good man today. She had built a beautiful life out of the ruins of a story she barely knew. And her sister was sitting in the back row of her wedding, holding the edge of a chair, trying to remember to breathe. The reception was where it happened. Enozi had stayed close, not too close. She was still watching, still calculating, still trying to find the right moment and the right words for something that had no right words. She had sent a message to Chisom, "I need 5 minutes with the bride, alone, before she enters the reception hall. Please."
Chisom, who knew Adeze well enough not to question the urgency in that tone, made it happen. They were in a small antechamber off the main corridor. The bride, Ngozi, Ada, the woman who was both and neither, had come in with a slightly puzzled smile, the polite curiosity of a woman who assumed this was a well-wisher with a special message. Adeze looked at her. Her throat had closed completely. She made herself speak. She said, "Your name. Before you were Ade Oyolaren, what was your name?" The bride's smile shifted. Something flickered behind her eyes. She had asked this question herself, quietly, over the years. She had never gotten a complete answer. She said, "I don't fully know." "Why?" Adeze reached up and touched the scar on the bride's jaw. It was a gentle touch, 2 fingers, barely a pressure. She said, "You fell from a guava tree in our grandmother's compound in Enugu. You were 3 years old, and I carried you home on my back screaming because I was so scared, and I kept saying your name over and over to keep you awake. Your name was Ngozi. My name is Adeze. I am your sister." The word sister hung in the air between them like something fragile. The bride looked at Adeze, and then something happened in her face that was not something you could name with a single word. It was a collapse and an opening at the same time. It was recognition arriving into a place that had spent its whole life waiting for exactly this. Her mouth opened. No sound came out. Her eyes filled with water that didn't fall yet, just gathered, gathering. She whispered, "Adeze?" And Adeze said, "Yes." That was when the tears came. Both of them, all at once. The kind of crying that comes when 23 years of missing someone are released in a single breath. They held each other in that small room, and neither of them could speak. They just held on. The bride was shaking. Adeze was shaking. Somewhere outside, the orchestra was playing. Somewhere outside, 100 guests were drinking champagne and laughing. And in this small room, 2 sisters who had lost each other in the rubble of childhood were finding their way back. Chisom came to check on them after 10 minutes. She opened the door, took one look at the 2 women holding each other on the floor of that antechamber, and immediately started crying herself without knowing the full story yet. She would know soon enough. Everyone would. But before the reunion could reach the ears of the world, something else was happening in that reception hall, something that would force the story out of the quiet and into the light far sooner than Adeze had planned. Mrs. Beatrice Chukwumeka had been watching. She had sharp eyes, this woman, and she had noticed that the maid she had chased away from the flower arrangement that morning had not, in fact, left the venue. She had noticed that this same woman in plain clothes had been moving through the hall with a comfort and ease that did not belong to hired help. She had noticed that Emeka's mother, Chisom, seemed to know this woman quite well, too well. And now this plain-clothed woman had apparently pulled the bride aside for a private conversation that had lasted long enough to delay the reception entrance. Mrs. Beatrice was not a woman who tolerated disruptions to her plans. She was already walking toward the antechamber when the door opened. She arrived at the corridor just as Adeze and Ngozi were stepping out together, both of them with swollen eyes and the raw faces of women who had just cried the kind of cry you cannot fake. Mrs. Beatrice looked at Adeze. She recognized her from the morning. Her jaw tightened. She said loudly, again, because this woman did everything loudly, "What is this maid still doing here? Someone explain to me right now why this woman is in my son's reception, pulling my daughter-in-law away from her own wedding." And then something happened that nobody in that corridor was prepared for. Emeka appeared behind his mother. He had been looking for his bride. He had heard his mother's voice and followed it. He took in the scene, his wife, this woman, his mother's posture, and he stepped forward and said, quietly but clearly, "Mama, stop." Mrs. Beatrice turned to look at her son. She had never heard that tone from him before. Emeka was a gentle man. He had never once spoken to her like that in 31 years. He said, "The woman you called a maid this morning, the woman you are calling a maid right now, her name is Adeze Okonkwo Briggs. She is my mother's oldest friend, and she is also
He paused because he was only just beginning to understand, only just piecing together what he was seeing in his wife's face. "She is also, I believe, my wife's sister." The corridor went very quiet. Nobody moved. It was the kind of stillness that happens in a space when information arrives that is too big to process while also performing normal physical functions. People standing in that corridor forgot to blink. Mrs. Beatrice's expression did something complicated. Anger, confusion, a flicker of something that might have been fear. She looked at Adeze again, this time without the lens of assumption. She looked at the way the two women were standing near each other, the matching grief and joy still raw on their faces. She looked at her son's face. Adeze spoke first. Not loudly. She did not need volume. She said, "I am not angry with you, Ma. People see what they expect to see. Today you expected to see a maid. You saw a maid. It is a small thing." It was perhaps the most devastating sentence that could have been delivered in that moment, because it came with complete gentleness, without a single edge of contempt, and that made it hit 10 times harder than any insult would have. Ngozi reached out and took Adeze's hand. She held it the way you hold something you are afraid might disappear again if you let go. Chisom stepped forward and addressed the corridor, which now included several guests who had wandered over to see why the reception entrance had been delayed. She said simply, "Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin the reception, the bride would like to make an announcement." They gathered, 100 people, maybe more, in a reception hall in Victoria Island on a Saturday afternoon in October. The crystal chandeliers threw light across everything. The flowers Mrs. Beatrice had spent a fortune on filled the air with a sweetness that felt almost ceremonial. Ngozi stood at the front of the room holding her husband's hand with one hand and her sister's hand with the other. She told them everything. Not all the details, the full story would take weeks to properly tell, but the outline, the separation, the search, the scar, the guava tree, the moment in the antechamber. By the time she finished, there was not a dry face in the hall. The photographer flown in from Johannesburg was crying behind his camera. The orchestra violinist had tears running into his collar. 3 of the older aunties were outright wailing in the way that Nigerian aunties wail when something enormous happens. A sound that is grief and joy and gratitude all poured together into one. Adeze stood beside her sister and felt something she had not felt in 23 years shift inside her chest, like a door that had been jammed shut for 2 decades had finally, at last, come unstuck. Mrs. Beatrice sat down heavily in the nearest chair. She was a woman of enormous pride, and pride is a rigid thing, and rigid things are the ones that break most spectacularly when the weight against them is finally too much. She sat there with her hands in her lap, and whatever that expression was on her face, it was not quite shame, and not quite remorse, and not quite relief, but it held all 3 somewhere inside it. Emeka knelt beside his mother's chair. He took her hands. He just held her hands and let the moment be what it was. The weeks that followed were not simple. Truth never arrives at a clean angle. There were DNA tests, taken privately, though everyone already knew what they would say. The results confirmed what a guava tree scar and 23 years of searching had already proven. There were long conversations, some in Adeze's penthouse, some in Ngozi and Emeka's new apartment in Lekki, some over the phone at hours when the rest of Lagos was asleep and the 2 sisters were making up for lost time.
There were hard questions. Ngozi had them. She had grown up not knowing. She had made peace with that not knowing, had built her identity carefully around it, and now the identity had expanded in a way that was simultaneously a gift and a disruption. She loved Adeze from the very first moment. Love does not wait for logic to catch up with it. But the love was also complicated, layered with loss and longing, and the strange grief of knowing what years had gone uncelebrated between them. There was also the matter of what Ngozi was now inheriting, not just emotionally, but in every other sense of the word. Adeze had spent years considering who would eventually carry the weight of Okonkwo Holdings. She had no children. She had colleagues and trusted lieutenants, but she had no family. The family question had never been resolved, because the family question had always been waiting on Enozi. She did not rush it. She did not arrive with a briefcase and a plan. She arrived with time and presence and patience. She began teaching Enozi the way an older sister teaches a younger one, starting with the small things, the principles, the instincts, the values that had built the empire before she ever taught the empire itself. Enozi had never thought of herself as a businesswoman. She was a teacher. She loved children. She loved the way knowledge moved between a mind that had it and a mind that needed it. But she was also, it turned out, her mother's daughter, in ways she had never had the opportunity to discover. She had a sharp and fearless kind of intelligence that the classroom had barely scratched the surface of. The world noticed. Business Lagos noticed. Mrs. Beatrice Chukwuemeka noticed too, from a distance, from a chair at Emeka's dining table on Sunday afternoons, where she had begun arriving with food she had cooked herself, a gesture so unlike her previous self that her own relatives whispered about it. She never said sorry in a direct sentence. That was not her language. But she came. She cooked. She sat. She learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to be in a room with her daughter-in-law's extraordinary sister without performing her own importance. It was, for her, the hardest and most necessary work of her life. There is a kind of arrogance that wears the face of standards. It looks like care, like order, like attention to detail. But what it is, underneath all that careful presentation, is fear. The fear of being revealed as ordinary. The fear that if you do not constantly announce your worth, the world will forget to assign you any. Enozi understood this. She had not always understood it. There were years when she herself had used her wealth as a wall, a distance keeper, a way of saying, I am here, I matter, look. But 23 years of searching for someone who had nothing to do with money or status or power had taught her something that no acquisition had ever taught her. The most valuable things in a life are the ones you cannot buy back once they are gone. Time, presence, the particular warmth of someone who knows your history and loves you anyway. She said it once, in an interview she rarely gave, to a journalist she trusted enough to let close. She said, "People thought I was building an empire. What I was actually doing was building a bridge. I just didn't know it until the day someone crossed it from the other side." That line made it onto billboards. People put it on phone wallpapers. It circled the internet the way that true things circle the internet, fast, because truth is light, and light moves without effort. But what the internet did not know, what the billboards could not capture, was that the night she said those words, she had gone home to her penthouse and walked to the east corridor and opened the pale yellow door for the first time. The room was empty. She had never put anything in it. She stood in the doorway of that empty yellow room and understood that she did not need it anymore. The bridge was no longer a bridge. It was a road, and Enozi was already walking on it. Some Sundays now, when the Lagos traffic gives the city a brief and unlikely peace, Enozi drives herself, not the Cullinan, just a regular car, quiet and unannounced, to Lekki Phase 2, where Emeka and Enozi live in a house with a garden and a gate that is always half open.
She brings something from the market, eddy sometimes, or garden eggs, or the particular type of bitter leaf that their mother used to put in the soup on Sunday afternoons in Enugu when they were very small and the world had not yet broken them apart. She walks in through the half-open gate. She does not knock. She goes straight to the kitchen. Enozi is usually already in there, and they cook together the way people cook who grew up learning the same recipes from the same hands, even if they never got to do it at the same time. They talk while they cook. They argue about small things. They laugh. There is a particular kind of laughing between people who share blood and history and loss and survival. It is a sound that holds all of those things inside it, and anyone close enough to hear it knows they are in the presence of something precious. Sometimes Emeka comes into the kitchen and watches the two of them and shakes his head with a smile, because he has never seen his wife this particular kind of happy, and it turns out this particular kind of happy was always available. It just needed the right door to open. And Mrs. Beatrice Chukwuemeka, who arrives every third Sunday without fail now, arms full of food she has cooked herself, sometimes sits at the kitchen table watching all of them and says nothing, just sits, just watches, learning, maybe, what it looks like when a room is full of the right people, what it sounds like when the noise you hear is not performance, but joy. She had tried to remove from that room the most valuable thing in it, and instead, without knowing it, she had started a chain of events that made the room whole. Life has a strange and ferocious sense of humor that way. And Ngozi's story, Ada's story, the story of a woman who walked down a wedding aisle not knowing her own sister was watching from the back row, became one of those stories that Lagos tells to itself at night, when it needs to remember that the city is not only made of noise and hustle and hunger, but also of this, of people finding each other, of things that were lost returning, of the long patience of love which outlasts everything, even 23 years of silence, even the assumptions of people who mistake the size of a person's clothes for the size of their soul. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love or someone you have lost or someone you are still hoping to find, leave something in the comments. Tell us where in the world you are watching from tonight. Tell us what this story made you feel. Your words matter more than you know, and every single one of them reaches us. If you enjoy thrilling African stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss one. Our community is growing, and it grows because of you. Stay kind, stay strong, and keep watching, because the next story begins with a question nobody in that room was brave enough to ask out loud, and the answer to that question will change everything you thought you knew.